I had nothing left to my name on the morning of November the 3rd, 1886, but a borrowed wagon, a brindle dog named Pell, and a way of reading the ground that my father had carried out of the Cornish mines and set down in me before the cough took him. The notice that ended my place in the world was not even given to my face. It was nailed to the door of the house my husband and I had built on the open tableland north of Calker in the high middle of Kansas, where the wind comes across 200 miles without meeting anything tall enough to slow it. The bank had called the note, and my husband, who had signed it without telling me, and spent it on a scheme in cattle that the dry summer killed, had ridden east 3 weeks before and left a single line on the table that said he would send for me when he was settled. He never wrote again, so I stood in my own yard at first light and read a paper that told me the land, the soddy, the well, and the lean-to were no longer mine, and I understood that a marriage and a deed can be undone by other men's signatures while you sleep. I will tell you the rest of it the way it happened, slow and in order, because the people who watched me that winter told it wrong for years, and I would like it set down once the way it was. Stay with me a while if you have ever been counted out by people who never asked what you knew. There is a warm room at the end of this, and a reckoning, and I promise you both. What I did not understand that morning, standing with the cold paper in my hand, and Pell pressed against my leg, was that the very thing the town would laugh at me. For through the whole of that autumn was the thing that it would keep 11 people alive when January came down on us like a hand closing. I did not understand it because I had not yet decided to do it. I only knew I had until the first hard freeze to be off the land, that I had $4 and some coin, and that a woman alone in that country, with winter coming, was, in the settled opinion of Calker City, already as good as buried. My father had been a tributor in the deep mines at Camborne before he ever crossed the water, a man who worked the rock on shares and lived or starved by how well he could read a seam. He brought almost nothing to Kansas but his hands and the things his hands knew, and a tin candle box with a sliding lid that had gone down the mines with him as a boy, and that he kept on the shelf by our door for 40 years. There was a man in our part of Cornwall, he used to say, who could put his ear to a working face and tell you whether the rock above would hold or come down on you in the night. And that man died old in his bed while braver men were carried up in pieces. And the difference between them was not courage but listening. My father listened to the ground the way other men listened to weather, and he taught me to do the same before I was old enough to know it was a rare thing. I was small when he would take me down the dry draws east of our claim and crouch and lay his palm flat on the south face of a cut bank and say, "Feel that, Mary. Feel how the ground holds the day's warmth long after the air has let go of it." He would make me hold my own small hand against the stone until I felt it, the slow heat coming up out of the earth into my palm at evening, when the air had already turned cold, and he would not let me up until I said I felt it, and I always did. The earth is a slow stove, he told me. It takes all summer to heat through, and it gives that heat back all winter if you know how to live inside it instead of on top of it. He had seen it in the mines, where the deep workings held one steady temperature winter and summer alike, where men stripped to the waist 1,000 feet down, while snow lay on the head frame above, and the cage came up rimed with ice. The cold cannot find you, he said, if you put enough earth between yourself and the sky. He told me once that a poor man could not buy warmth, but he could dig for it, that the rich kept the cold out with coal and money, and the wise kept it out with depth and patience, and that of the two the second never ran short. I was 9 years old, holding my hand to a warm bank in the falling dark, and I did not know I was being given the only inheritance that would ever matter. He died when I was 14, of a cough that came up out of those same Cornish mines and followed him across an ocean and finally caught him in a sod house on a prairie that could not have been less like the place that made it. And I married at 17 because that is what a girl without people did. And for 11 years I lived on top of the ground in a soddy that froze at the corners and baked in July. And I forgot, the way you forget a language you do not speak, what my father had set in my hands. My husband was not a cruel man, only a weak one, forever certain that the next thing would be the thing that made us, the next quarter section, the next dozen head of cattle, the next dry land scheme that the country swallowed without a trace. And I had learned to hold my tongue and keep the household together over the holes his certainty kept opening under us. When he left, I did not weep for him so much as for the 11 years, and when the bank's notice came, I understood that a man can spend your whole life on a wager, and the loss falls on you alone. It came back to me on the 4th of November, the day after the notice, while I was driving Pell and the wagon south and east with no place to go, looking for any quarter of ground a dispossessed woman might be let to sit on. The dog rode with his chin on my knee, and the wagon was loaded with everything I had left in the world, which was not much more than a feather bed, a chest of tools that had been my father's, the tin candle box, a barrel of meal, and the $4 knotted in the corner of my apron. I came to a stretch of broken country, along a dry creek the maps called Limestone, a place nobody had filed on because it was cut through with ravines and ledges and was no good for a plow. And there, in the south bank of the deepest ravine, where the creek had worked through the centuries down to bedrock, I saw the thing my father had described to me 100 times, a face of limestone, 10 feet high and dry, leaning a little back from the weather, with a seam of softer shale running through its middle that a patient person could work out with a pick. South-facing, so the low winter sun would lie on it all the short day, out of the wind, with the high north lip of the ravine standing between it and every storm that country could throw, with the whole weight of the prairie above it for a roof. I sat on the wagon seat a long time looking at it, and Pell looked at it too, and I felt the slow heat of my father's hand come up through 40 years and settle in my chest, and I knew before I climbed down what I was going to do. I drove the stakes that afternoon. I worked until dark clearing the brush from the foot of the face, and I slept that first night in the wagon with the dog against me and the limestone at my back already giving off the day's stored warmth into the cold, proving itself to me before I had moved a single stone. The land was unclaimed, and I filed on it the following week at the land office in Calker, and the clerk looked at the description and asked me what, in the name of sense, I meant to farm on a creek bed full of rock, and I told him I did not mean to farm it at all. And that was the first time I saw the look I would come to know well that winter, the look a person gives you when they have decided you are touched and have stopped listening. He filed it anyway, because the law did not require a woman to be sensible, only to be first. And I was the first and the only fool who had ever wanted that ground. The man who fastened the name on me was Howell Trask, who kept the store on the main street of Calker City, and sat through every slow afternoon on a chair on his porch with 3 or 4 other men, watching the road and rendering judgment on everyone who passed along it. I had to buy from him because there was nowhere else, and the second time I came in for blasting powder and a new pick handle and a keg of nails, he leaned back and asked the porch at large what a woman wanted with powder, and one of them said she means to dig herself a grave and save the trouble. And Trask laughed his easy laugh and said, "No, no, she means to live in the ground like a badger," and that is what they called it from then on. The badger hole, to Trask and the men on his porch, and in time to half the county. I was the badger woman, and the place I was making was the badger hole, and they said it the way you say a thing that has stopped being a person and become a story you tell to pass an afternoon. I let them talk. My father had taught me that too, without meaning to. A seam does not argue with the men who say it is barren. It simply holds the silver and waits and is proven by the assay and not by the talk. So I drove back out to Limestone Creek with my powder and my pick handle, and Pell rode beside me on the wagon seat with his nose into the cold wind, and I began the slow work of proving the ground. I want to tell you how it was built because the building is the whole of it, and because every piece of it that the town found ridiculous was a piece that did its work when the work was needed. I started at the dry shale seam in the middle of that limestone face, and I worked it back into the bank by hand, a few feet a week, levering out the soft rock with a bar and a pick and barrowing it away and squaring the walls as I went. It was slow work and it was hard work, and my hands cracked and bled and healed over harder, and there were days the powder did more than the pick, and days the powder did nothing, and I went back to the bar. The limestone above held itself like a roof beam, the way stone does when you leave it a proper arch and do not fight its grain, and I cut the ceiling not flat but in a low curve, because my father had told me that a flat roof of stone wants to fall, and a curved one wants to stand, that the weight of the whole prairie pressing down on an arch only locks it tighter. His voice was in my hands the whole time, telling me to follow the seam and not to hurry the stone, telling me to test the ceiling with the back of the pick and listen for the sound that means sound rock and the duller sound that means a slab ready to come down. By the middle of December, I had a chamber dug back 14 feet into the bank, 8 feet wide, 6 feet to the ceiling at the crown of the arch, with the living rock on 5 sides of me, and only the south wall open to the world. The cold could reach me from one direction only, and that direction I meant to close. I floored it with flat creek stone laid tight and swept, and I cut a lip at the mouth so the meltwater of a thaw would run out and not in. I learned the rock as I went, where it was hard, and where it crumbled, where a hidden seam of clay would weep a little water that I had to channel away, and the chamber took its final shape not from a drawing, but from a long conversation between my hands and the bank, the way my father said all real building is made. There was no plan on paper anywhere. There was only the seam and the listening and the slow accumulation of a room out of solid ground. A man named Easton Hale rode out in late November to look at what I was doing, and he was the one bright thread in that whole gray season. He was the county surveyor, a young man with a careful way of speaking, and ink stains worked permanent into the side of his right hand, sent to confirm my filing and the boundaries of my odd little claim. And where everyone else saw a badger hole, he crouched at the mouth of my dug chamber and put his hand on the limestone the way my father used to, and was quiet a long moment, and then asked me to explain the principle to him. I told him plainly, the way my father told me. I said the ground holds the summer's heat and gives it back slow, that the deep earth stays near one temperature the year round, that a fire in a closed rock chamber has almost nothing to warm but the air and the people because the walls are already warm from the world's own heat and do not drink the fire the way Asadi's frozen walls drink it. He took out a little book and wrote it down. He wrote down the depth and the facing and the thickness of stone over my head, and he asked me how I knew to curve the ceiling and how I had set the flue, and he wrote those answers down too. He said he had read of such dwellings in the old countries, cut into hillsides where the winters were long, and never thought to see one made on the bare Kansas plain by a woman with a pick. Before he rode off, he stood and looked back at the dark mouth of the chamber and said a thing I held on to through the worst of what came. He said, "You have built this on a true idea, and a true idea does not care who laughs at it." I have wondered since whether he knew, saying it, how much I would need it. I did not build it for myself alone, though I told no one that. Across the autumn, I had taken in 2 souls the town had no use for. There was a widow named Effie Crane, whose husband had died of the flux in October, and whose own people were back in Ohio and slow to send the money for her passage, a small, worn woman who had been turned out of her rented soddy when she could not pay, and had been sleeping in a neighbor's stable when I found her. And there was her boy, a quiet child of 7 named Tom, who followed Pell everywhere and called the dug chamber the cave and loved it without 1 ounce of the town's contempt. They had nowhere, the same as me, and 3 people who have nowhere can make a household out of a hole in the ground if the hole is built on a true idea. So I dug the chamber larger than one woman needed. I dug sleeping ledges into the rock along 2 walls and lined them with prairie hay and what quilts we had between us. I cut a smaller second room, back of the first, for the stores, and I filled it through November and December with everything I could trade my labor and my last coin for, because my father's other lesson, the one underneath all the others, was that warmth without fuel is a promise you cannot keep. That was the firewood. Anyone who has crossed that part of Kansas knows the joke in it, that there is no wood on the high plains, that a homesteader burned twisted hay and dried dung and corn cobs and counted herself lucky for a fence rail. Yet the creeks ran with cottonwood and willow and box elder in the bottoms, scrub that no one wanted because it burned fast and dirty. And all autumn, while the town watched the badger woman dig her grave, I was dragging deadfall out of every draw within 4 miles and ricking it in long stacks that I then walled into the dry back chamber of my dug house, cord upon cord of it, more wood than 3 people could burn in 3 winters, because I did not know how long the cold would last, and I had learned young never to be caught short of the one thing that stands between you and the dark. I built a hearth of flat creek stone against the limestone wall and ran the smoke out through a shaft I cut at a slant up through the rock to the prairie above, a narrow flue lined with stone, angled so the wind across the grass would draw it rather than push it back, and I hung a flap of green hide at the south mouth that I could drop against the weather and pin at the edges with stones. If you have stayed with me this far, you have already guessed more than the town did. You can see the room full of wood and the warm stone and the slanting flue, and you understand what they were for. Hold the picture, because the cold that proved it is coming. And I want you to feel the gap between what they thought they saw and what was truly there. Through December, the town's joke hardened into something with more teeth in it. The 3rd week of that month, there was a church social in Calker, and I went because I needed the warmth of company more than I would admit, and because Effie wanted to see other faces, and Trask was there holding court by the stove with his thumbs in his vest. And when I came in, he said to the room, loud enough that he meant it to carry, "Here is the badger woman come up out of her hole. Mind your roots, boys. She may dig under the floor." The room laughed, not all of it, but enough, and a woman near me looked at her own boots, and I took my coffee, and I did not answer, because a seam does not argue. It was at that social, though, that Trask told a traveling man from Beloit in my hearing that there was a madwoman out on Limestone Creek who had buried herself alive with a widow and a child, and ought by rights to have them taken from her before she got them killed. That was the cruelest thing said to me that winter, because it dressed contempt up as concern, and because for one cold hour it made me doubt the only thing I was sure of. I drove home through a hard wind with that sentence riding behind me, and I went down into the chamber where Effie had a low fire going, and Tom was asleep on his ledge with Pell curled against him, and the rock gave back the small fire's heat so evenly that the room sat warm as a spring morning, while the wind screamed across the prairie 18 feet above our heads, and I put my hand on the dry, warm stone, and I knew Trask was wrong, and I let the doubt go out of me like breath. I should tell you about the weather signs, because my father read weather the way he read rock, and I had that from him too. The 1st week of January, I drove into Calker one last time for salt and a coil of rope, and Trask was on his porch even in the cold, wrapped to the chin, and he watched me load the wagon. and called out that the badger had best get back. To her hole there was weather coming, and badgers froze same as Christians. The men on the porch laughed, and that was the last time anyone in that county said the word to me in scorn, though none of us knew it then. I gathered my reins and drove out, and I marked the things my father had taught me to mark. The geese that should have been long gone came over very high and very fast, all going south together in long, ragged lines that did not call the way geese call, but went over in a kind of hurry that was its own warning. The cattle in the distant pastures stood with their tails to the north and would not graze. The sky on the 8th had a hard, brassy color along the southern edge that I did not like at all, a color my father would have named, and I had no name for, only the dread of it. The well rope grew stiff in a single night. The dog would not leave the chamber mouth and stood there looking north with the hair lifting along his spine. On the morning of the 10th, the air had that flat, dead stillness that my father called the silence before the rock falls, the stillness of a thing gathering itself. And I brought in the last of the water and the last armful of green wood to dry by the hearth, and I dropped the hide flap and pinned it with the heaviest stones, and I told Effie we would not be going out for some while. She asked how long. I told her I did not know, and that it did not matter, because we had wood for a month and the ground would keep us, and I believed it, and the believing was my father's gift, more than any number of cords of wood. The storm that the records later called the blizzard of January 11th and 12th came down out of the northwest in the middle of the afternoon, and I have never in my life seen the like of it, before or since. It came not as a rising thing, but all at once a wall, a gray wall that crossed the prairie from the northwest at the speed of a galloping horse, and where it passed the day went out as if a lamp had been blown. The temperature, which a man in Calker read off his glass and wrote in a book that survives, fell from a little above freezing to 38 degrees below zero in the space of one afternoon, a drop of better than 60 degrees in a few hours, and the wind behind it came at better than 60 miles in the hour, and drove a snow so fine and so fast that it was less like snow than like ground glass blown level across the land, and a man caught in it could not see his own hand at the end of his arm, nor draw a breath that did not freeze in his throat. We heard it come. Down in the rock we heard the wind find the prairie above us and rise to a long scream that did not stop for 2 days, and the hide flap shuddered against its stones, and Tom pressed close to me and asked if it would come in, and I told him no. The ground was between us and it, and the ground does not move. They learned afterward what the storm had done. It killed 230 people across the plains states in those 2 days. School children caught walking home from country schools when the wall crossed at the hour of dismissal. Men frozen stiff between the house and the barn, with the guide rope not yet strung. Whole families found in the spring where the drifts had stood over them all winter. In Mitchell County alone, where I lived, 9 people died in those 2 days, and a 10th lost both his feet to the frost and lived a cripple. A family 3 miles east of me burned their furniture, and then their floorboards, and then the wagon box, and were found alive but ruined, their hands and faces black with it. A young man named Pruitt died 40 rods from his own door, gone out for an armful of fuel, and turned around by the White, and never found his way back, and his fuel pile that winter had been corn cobs and twisted hay. 3 days of burning at the most, against a cold that lasted longer than that. I want you to hold those numbers, because here are the others against them. Down in the rock, 18 feet under the screaming prairie, with the hide flap pinned and the slant flue drawing clean, my one small hearth fire kept the chamber at a heat I judged by my father's old measure to be near 60 degrees, shirt-sleeve warm, while the air, a few feet above the grass, was killing grown men in minutes. We had wood for a month, and in those 2 days we burned, perhaps, the worth of an afternoon's gathering. We had water and meal and a side of bacon and a crock of beans, and we had each other, and we were not cold, not once, not for 1 hour of those 2 days. Tom thought it was the finest thing that had ever happened to him. He and Pell lay by the fire, and he asked me to tell him again how the ground was a slow stove, and I told him, and he fell asleep before I finished, and I went on telling it low to the fire anyway. Effie sat mending by the steady light, with her face calm for the first time since her husband died, and the rock around us held its warmth the way it had held it through 10,000 summers, indifferent and faithful, and above us the worst storm that country had ever seen did its work on the people who had laughed. It was the steam that brought them. On the second morning, when the wind had dropped enough for a man to move, those few in the neighboring country who had survived came out to count their dead and find their stock, and a party of them working south along Limestone Creek to look for a missing herd saw a strange thing in the white waste where they had been told nothing living could be. They saw a thin, straight column of steam and smoke rising up out of the snow itself, out of the flat, blank drift where my slant flew, breathed at the surface, and they did not know what to make of it. A chimney with no house, smoke coming up out of the ground. In a country where everything above the ground was dead, they dug down toward it along the line of the creek bank until they found the south face and the snowed-over hide flap, and the man whose hand pulled that flap back was Howell Trask. He had come out with the others to look for his brother's cattle, and what he found instead was a doorway in the rock breathing warm air into a 38 below morning. I heard the scrape of boots on frozen stone and the muffled voices above, and I lifted the flap from the inside, and the cold fell in past me like a living thing. And there stood Trask with the frost white in his beard, and his eyes streaming from the wind, and his hands wrapped in rag, looking past me into a warm room where a widow sat mending, and a child slept by a fire, and a stack of cordwood rose to the ceiling in the back, and the heat rolled out of that doorway and up into his frozen face. He did not say anything for a long moment. He stood there with the dead white prairie at his back, a country with 9 fresh dead in it, and the warm amber light on his face, and he looked at the room and at the wood and at the sleeping child, and last of all at me. Behind him the other men crowded to see, their breath smoking, and none of them spoke either. Then Trask took his hat off. A man does not take his hat off to a badger hole. What he finally said, he said quietly, with none of the porch left in his voice. He said, "I was wrong about you." That was the whole of it. 4 words, and a beat of silence after them, in which the only sound was the small fire and the wind dying off the snow, and somewhere behind me Tom turning in, his sleep, and I have turned those 4 words over for 40 years, and found nothing under them but the plain truth of a man who had laughed at a thing because he did not understand it and was no longer laughing. I did not say I told you so. My father had not raised me to that, and there was no satisfaction in it that I could find, only a great and quiet tiredness, and under the tiredness a thing I had no name for that I have since learned to call peace. I stood back from the doorway, and I said there was room and warm and coffee on the stone, and come in out of it, all of you, and they came down into the rock out of the killing cold. 8 more of them that morning, men who had buried themselves in haystacks and lost neighbors in the night, men who had called me the badger woman on Trask's porch, and now sat along my dug ledges with their wrapped hands held out to my fire, 11 souls in all under that limestone roof, and not one of them was lost. They were quiet a long time, all of them in the warmth. There is a silence that comes on people who have been close to dying and are suddenly not, and it filled my small stone room that morning more completely than any words. And I let it be, and I poured the coffee, and the ground went on giving back its warmth, as if it had been waiting all along to be asked. I will not pretend the town changed all at once, because people do not, and the ones who have wronged you do not always come and say so. The spring after that winter, though, men began driving out to Limestone Creek to look at how it was made, and they did not call it the Badger Hole anymore. Easton Hale, the young surveyor, had kept his notes, and he wrote the thing up plainly. The depth and the facing and the slant of the flue and the principle underneath it all. And he read it before the county, at the courthouse in Beloit, and within 2 years there were a dozen rock-cut and earth-bermed winter rooms dug into south banks across that part of Kansas, and within 10 there were more than anyone could count. They learned the way people learn, imperfectly. Some dug into north banks and wondered why they stayed cold and quit. Some cut the flue straight up and choked on their own smoke and blamed the method. The ones who understood that it was not the hole, but the idea behind the hole, the slow, warm patience of the deep earth, those ones built rooms that their grandchildren were still wintering in when I was an old woman, and the idea outlived every single person who had laughed at it on Howell Trask's porch. Trask himself became, of all the strange turns that winter took, the method's loudest friend. He who had named the Badger Hole spent the last 20 years of his life telling every who would listen that the soundest winter shelter on the high plains was a south-cut room in a creek bank, and he sent more than one struggling family out to me to be shown how, and he never once, to his credit, pretended he had not laughed first. The cruelest tongue in the county became the patientest teacher, and I have come to believe that is the best a wrong person can hope for in this life. Not that the ones who hurt you are destroyed, but that they are turned and stand at last on the side of the thing they mocked. Effie Crane's people sent for her at last that spring, and she went back to Ohio. But Tom did not want to go, and in the end he stayed, and I raised him as my own. And the cave he loved at 7, he learned to cut himself at 17, and he dug winter rooms for half the county before he was 30, and taught his own children the slow stove lesson my father had carried. Out of the Cornish dark, Pell lived 9 more winters by that hearth, and is buried above the chamber on the south bank, where the first sun of every winter, morning falls, and I have asked to be put there beside him when my time comes, in the warm ground out of the wind. I am an old woman now, and I have outlived Trask and Hale, and nearly everyone who stood in the snow that morning, and the country has filled up, and the soddies are gone, and the Badger Hole jokes are forgotten, and sometimes a young person who does not know the story asks me why an old woman would choose to be buried in a creek bank instead of the churchyard. I tell them about the slow stove. I tell them my father laid his hand on a south-cut bank when I was 9 years old and gave me the only inheritance that ever kept anyone alive, the kind that lives in the hands and not in the deed box, the kind no bank can call and no husband can sign away in the night. And on the coldest mornings, when the prairie above Limestone Creek lies white and blank and dead to the far edge of the sky, there is still one place where a thin, straight thread of steam rises up out of the snow, where the ground breathes warm into the killing air, where someone who learned the patience of the deep earth has kept a fire all winter under the laughing world, and that thread of steam is the truest thing my father ever left me, rising still, long after all the laughter has gone quiet under the same warm ground.